Well, is it choppy if I do this?
I wonder if it's going to the Zoom cloud.
Okay.
We'll find out. We pay for Zoom, so hopefully we have space on the Zoom cloud.
Yes.
So I was going to say that the disconnect was objectively bad. I don't know if that's true either. But I guess also we're not talking objectively bad. So that's I think
Right.
part of
That's
the
the
big thing
thing. Unless you want to, I mean, we can certainly get into
that's
that.
what we tried to avoid in the good conversation because you can talk about objectively good. I talking about objectively bad gets real hairy real quick.
Sure does.
I think maybe we should hash that out a little bit because that's we're not we weren't touching on that directly, but that's the tricky part is people have to act to some degree for their belief systems that there's an objectively bad.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, there has to be a creed, right? Like there has to be some sort of code that helps you define that. There has to be metrics. I'll just keep using that word because I think it is because you do. There's always the scales. Hell, that's used in a lot of mythologies, right? In Egypt, you were weighed when you died. Do your good deeds outweigh your bad ones, essentially?
But you have to believe it's the for the average person, I would say, or at least how can I put that? It's a normal condition to if you believed that the bad in your life was only bad subjectively, you'd have a hard time acting like it was bad some of the times, right? Like that's real tenuous.
Hmm. Yeah, we don't do super well with subjective matters
And
because
unfortunately, most of them
yeah,
are.
right. Well, I mean, if you think of it psychologically, as I tend to, our brains search for patterns. They search for meaning. We need we need objectivity. So it'll create objectivity out of nothing. That's why Pixar is so successful. Pixar has given objectivity uh subjectivity. How can I put that? Toys, Toy Story. Like they've given inanimate things personalities, cars, all
Mhm.
that stuff. They've put personality into things that really we shouldn't really think too hard about because they're just
Yeah.
whatever. But no, because we crave Pixar. I will forever like throw that at Pixar. They are amazing because those storytellers and animators are the modern day homers and all that kind of stuff, like
Myth
they
tellers.
yeah, they really are. Because what they're doing isn't new as far as storytelling, I should say, because a lot of the stories they even tell are old stories just repackaged a little bit. And
Mhm.
again, that's not new. I'm not dunking on them for that because that's Disney's done that since day one. But so suffice it to say, we define good and bad because we need to. Our
Mhm.
brains won't let us. They won't let us not do it. That's why Zen and all those types of things that try to keep everything subjective, objectively subjective. um, uh, that's the lucky charms of Zen. They're objectively subjective.
Uh, yeah, but it's the reason that those things don't work well
Yeah,
pragmatically. And the tricky thing is they
it takes
could.
work to like wrap your head around that because our brains aren't meant to do that necessarily.
Mhm. Um, and it's I don't know. I would need to do more study in uh, is it who's the old man that was a political philosopher in China?
Confucius.
Confucius. Okay.
Yes.
Because yeah, Confucius had some of that. Um, he still believed kind of in the bureaucratic religion a little bit, from my understanding. Um, but he took more from the kind of Zen Taoist traditions. Um, and the both the politicians and the people they served, because they served their people, did
Mhm.
very, very well. So well that the ruling elite was like, this can't continue. So it can be done. And in fact, when done well, it is the thing that everybody wants. It just takes a lot more work to get there.
Sure. If you'd like, I can speak into Confucianism a little bit.
Sure.
Uh, so its main thing, Confucius says that yeah, it is. So he did do the whole heaven as a bureaucracy thing, and he kind of waved the flag of heaven on earth type stuff. We should mimic heaven as earth, which is in the Lord's Prayer. It's in a lot of things, right?
Mm,
Uh, and so that concept isn't necessarily new, but the Zen type thought that you mentioned going into it is that it's about fulfilling your role. So it's not about climbing the ladder. It's about polishing your rung on the ladder. And that's what creates a good society is everyone finding their slot. It's a jigsaw puzzle. Once everyone's in their spot that they are shaped for, that they're made for, then society flourishes and you are fulfilled because you're filling your role. Um, and that doesn't necessarily mean the kind of US version of discover your role type of thing. It's kind of whatever you're put into, you should do the best at. So if you get a job as a janitor, you should be the damn best janitor, you can possibly be. Put
mm,
your efforts and your mind. That's the Zen part. No matter what you're doing, put yourself fully into it and you will find, you know, peace in that. You will find fulfillment in doing that.
happiness, maybe.
I mean, if that's how you define happiness, yes, which
Yeah,
a lot of
'cause
folks do.
that was kind of where we got to with the happiness one. Is it's people would be happier with that. To kind of keep on the, I guess, in the political sphere, like the good and bad thing. My understanding of, because Confucius was big in politics, because he also believed that the way a politician should do that to polish their skill was in their way they serve their people.
Oh yeah, that's what being a politician usually is defined. It's not. It's kind of the do as I say, not as I do kind of thing. But
Mhm.
but yeah,
Um,
absolutely. Politicians are meant to serve the people.
mhm. uh, so yeah, there is, I guess, to that effect. Like there is a way to. Well, okay, maybe let's dig into. So, what would Confucius consider bad? At least
Ah,
that
okay.
train of thought.
There we go. So, uh, it's important to note just some context around Confucius. Not much is known about the guy as an individual. Most of what we know of Confucius came from the writings not of himself but his students. Um, there was a lot of war in China, and dynasties rose and fell, and conquering happened, and sources were destroyed a lot of the time. Uh, and it was also during the what do they call it, the 10,000 schools, or I there's a period in China of just blossoming, booming philosophical schools, and he was one of many, 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 many. So a lot of his things are secondary sources and stuff like that. So everything with a grain of salt. But in general, what Confucius would consider bad, according to his students and the legends about him, uh, is, how can I put it? So Confucianism and Taoism are often put on at odds with each other, because the concept is order versus, like, the concept is building order versus um, going with the flow, of the natural order. Because heaven is supernatural, right? So we have to make that happen.
Mm,
We have to bring that down to us. And whereas the world itself and the universe is completely natural. So if we just keep on keeping on, then
mhm.
we are doing good. It's that concept. Whereas Confucian thought is, you know, we must use the natural world, but we must, that's just that, use it, not ride it. So we have to build society. We have to, create heaven on earth. Earth isn't heaven type of thing.
Mm.
So that, I don't know if you would consider that evil, right? Like maybe that's a different concept.
Yeah.
But he would consider it, against perhaps, or at least not up to par with his ideal.
Yeah. In the earlier part when what did you say? You mentioned, oh, you mentioned greed in passing.
Sure.
Uh,
Yeah.
and how we can pretty as close to objective as you can say greed is bad.
Yeah.
And I let my subconscious kind of run, a sub thought process on.
You opened a new tab on that one.
Yeah, because I think Confucius would agree to the 7 deadly sins as a good summation of what's bad. And I have, my love hate with certain parts of that kind of religious doctrine. But the 7 deadly sins are pretty good at narrowing down all of what could be objectively bad into very structured ways to look at them.
Yeah. And the best part is those are universal in that most philosophies will argue that anything, more or less of anything, is more or less fine. It's the concept of too much.
Mm-hmm.
That's, I think, what the 7 deadly sins are for, because sex is not evil. A sex addiction, that's disrupting your life and therefore society, all that kind of stuff. Eating food, obviously not bad. Liking food, not really that bad. Putting your life around consuming, not good. All that kind of stuff. So, and obviously greed is one of those of like, we should want things. It's natural. It's in our biology, first of all, to do that. But then there's becoming Smaug, where you just get it all and sit on it.
Yeah, because I think, it's that runaway element of a piece of human nature that within an organized society is considered bad.
Mm-hmm. Yes. Now we're onto it. I like that. Yeah.
Mm.
But that's just it. It's and that's in every, from what I can tell. All right. I don't know everything about everything, but from what I can surmise, that's in like every philosophy that I've really come across. Even like, more about this than I do, but hedonism, right?
Mm-hmm.
So you've told me this before, I think, but like the concept, because people feel that hedonism is, all about really just diving into the sensual of every aspect. But I think can you talk about that? Because I remember you saying it's not quite that.
To use terms of the trade, it's stoic pleasure. That's the thing that everybody misses, because the concept is it's the highest pleasure. What you should chase is the highest pleasure. The highest pleasure is peace. And people just take out the stoic part of it and they're like, oh, whatever means pleasure to me. No. That's not what hedonism was designed to be. It was, there's the highest pleasure and everything should be built around that. And the highest pleasure was, I don't know enough contextually to say it was influenced by like the Stoic movement, but that was kind of the concept. It was a Stoic style of pleasure, because anything that disturbed your peace was taken away from your pleasure. So
right.
Okay. But to defend,
so it's not like the orgies of Bacchus and all that kind of stuff.
Nope. But see, that's the thing though, right? In a certain lineage of the pagan development, all the 7 deadly sins are redeemed by a sanctification of them all being given up to the beauty of the natural world.
Okay, this is new to me. I haven't quite haven't quite eaten this apple yet.
Yeah, because
can you speak more on that?
Yeah, the easiest one to do is lust of life, right? So it's not lust in the terms of physical pleasure. It's the lust of you're alive and the whole universe is built um, for you to experience, not necessarily in the ego sense of like the world was built for me, but you were built in such a way to experience the universe. The universe has created this experience, like having a machine, and then made like and around it is all this experience to have.
Sure.
So
Yeah, that's
lust,
that's the one phrase. I'm going to interrupt you because I just love this phrase so much. I wouldn't get many quotes tattooed on my body, but this one I definitely would. It's "You are the universe experiencing itself."
yes.
That's
So the concept is that all seven deadly sins are redeemed when given over to that creed. So you're not lusting after somebody, you're lusting after experience itself, because experience itself is life itself. Same thing with greed, pride, all of that. It's you're basically letting the sin, like what would be considered the sin, become sinless because you're removing your ego from it and allowing just the natural energy of that to connect with its own natural conclusion.
how very zen. I like that.
Um, so the catch with that one is the seven deadly sins then are the seven. You could even the word sin doesn't work then because the traditional form of sin is missing the mark, um, and the connotation of sin is evil. So it would be the seven deadly forces basically, where it's like
Okay.
even in those traditions, you had to be philosophically constituted because otherwise they would destroy you. Because if you did it in the form of ego, then they were the seven deadly sins. So it was still there, but there was an added layer to it.
That's very interesting. You know what you had just made me think of, and this really helps us dive into the dichotomy of good versus evil in a very contemporary way, is the story of Star Wars. Honestly, like the universe of Star Wars, specifically noting the Jedi Order and the Sith Order,
Mhm.
because that's, you know, love or hate Star Wars, you can't deny that that's a huge part of it, is this good versus evil duality type thing.
Didn't try very hard to hide that.
No, and I'll never argue that. People make it. It's one of those things. People make it deep.
Mhm.
um, but that's part of the beauty of it, is you can expound on it all you want because it's simple concepts that have very deep rooted meanings, societally, historically. So the Sith, because this is we're focusing on the bad, the evil, let's say, and the Sith are usually lauded as the bad guys in Star Wars, because that is the Sith, like codex. The Sith code is to go too far on purpose.
Mhm.
That's the whole thing, because the Jedi are very much about restraint and controlling yourself and all that kind of stuff, and finding peace in that kind of settling motion, where the Sith are all about finding peace in going as far as you possibly can in order to dominate.
No,
They're ego based. The Sith is ego based. It's all
yeah,
about them personally.
yeah, and I don't think you could use the word peace though, because the whole point is you want as much chaos as possible, and you just need
Sure.
to be strong enough to channel it.
Yeah. Yeah. So maybe not peace, but they want, domination, that kind of peace, the peace of power.
Yes, yes.
Right. Whereas so the Jedi want the peace of, simplicity, like settling, that just
Mhm.
everything returning to the unshaken pond.
Well, checking power versus leaving power unchecked.
Yeah, it's true. It's true. Yes. And that's like part of the Sith code is, use your anger, let it fuel all of your stuff. Use your greed, like it all kind of fuels into anger eventually, because anger is the fuel for action in a lot of us. It's emotional action. Anger makes us do stuff.
Mhm. Although I think the thing we're like spiraling around here is it's bad. See, we'll have to fight this next, but we've consistently come across a theme that bad comes from uh
Excess.
in relation to ego identity.
Okay. Yeah. Well, because I mean, otherwise we're just falling into the philosophical good of it just is.
Mm.
So without the ego, it just is. And it is not bad because it just is.
But there's the difference of like recognizing your ego, um, and realizing it's a part of you, like an organ, versus identifying with your ego, and that can be, natural as it were. But the seven deadly sins are dangerous and constitute what is, pretty close to objectively bad when it's the ego being greedy. It's the ego lusting when it's not you pushing your ego to the side and seeing where it connects to whatever's past the ego. Um, but when I think about like, I don't want to use this example, but if you can think of a better one, but like Nazi Germany, right?
Okay.
I don't know if you could argue or how you would argue for or against that was an ego driven set of behaviors because it was so in mass.
Well, yeah, that is the dark side of nationalism, right? Like, because nationalism in and of itself isn't necessarily evil or bad, but it's when it's taken to that extreme, right? Of we need to defend our nation, and when defending our nation, building our nation turns into dominating other nations, and of course the fucking Holocaust, which is objectively bad. Because there's definitely, that's the thing where it's killing versus murder. That was murder. War causes a lot of killing. The Holocaust was straight up murder. That's not in any way good,
But the question I am trying to work through here is,
Yeah.
can we distill that bad down to the same ego corruption? Or is it different because the people were sacrificing their ego to the nation, right? And that the nation itself had this corruption. Or was it that each individual's ego was systematically corrupted along the way? So it still was the same thing. I guess that's the distinction, trying to see how we can play with that.
Sure. Yeah. Well, I'll kind of start that a little bit with the Taoist concept of the uncarved block, right? Whereas most, I don't know, philosophies or societies most of our thought patterns are about, building something or in the terms of the block, like sculpting a statue, right? And to sculpt a statue, you need to chip away at stuff in order to create the features you need. Whereas the Taoist attitude is like, well, there was nothing wrong with the marble. The block was fine. The block was natural. That was great. It's fine. It's perfect the way it is. Their other concept that Taoists talk about quite a bit is the fact that, babies are, in a way, right? Now, I'm not talking biologically, but philosophically, I suppose you could say babies are more or less perfect beings. They show up, they exist, they explore the universe as it is, accept things as they come or don't, they discover things with no preconceived notions, with no biases, with no thought pattern other than what's this, and just discovering what it is. Babies are eternally curious and malleable and all that. So, newborns are essentially perfect beings in that sense. They're the uncarved block, right? Nothing is wrong with them. They're great the way they are. Not biologically so, obviously. Like, that's a whole another thought. But so to kind of talk about your question is, people are systematically corrupted. We are. I mean, everyone is. No one gets out of this alive.
Mhm.
uh, call it trauma, call it propaganda, call it brainwashing, uh, call it biases. Like there's multitudes of situations in which we are swayed, and our brains change, because it is building neurons, especially, between the ages of, 1 and technically around 25, when our brains more or less finish developing and growing. Our brains can still adapt and change. So people should never stop trying to do that. But biologically speaking, our brains are done growing by around that time. So that's a tough one, because I mean, a lot of it is on purpose. That's where politics and religion come in, maybe even with the best of intentions, right? But it is meant to put the bumpers up so that you can
Mhm.
only have kind of one direction to travel. So it is
But so to like hone in on it,
yeah,
we can agree pretty easily that the corruption can spread.
yes.
But the question is it corrupting their egos, or was it people were putting aside their ego and then that was getting corrupted, right? That's were they caught up in somebody else's sin, or were they joining their own sin to it?
Ooh, okay.
Because
Caught up in somebody else's sin.
because thinking about it, I think you can make a case that it was people adding their sin to it. Um, so because specifically, if you look at the propaganda style of the Nazi Party, it was that it was see, yeah, this is where it gets real dancing the line, because it was about German pride, but the concept was you're a German, you should have pride. So it wasn't uh you should be like proud just to be a German. It was trying to get them to have their own pride, right? I think that
Yeah,
would be the case I'd try and make. Because to me, to have that level of intensity, I don't know if you could have done that without enlisting other people's egos. So maybe it was their egos being corrupted. Because I just don't know if you could have had that level of buy-in if the individual people weren't letting their own egos join in on the sin, as it were.
certainly. Yeah. Yeah, that is a good question. And that brings even further questions of, I mentioned let's say the Confucian ideal of whatever role you're put in, be the best at that.
Mhm.
Like, well, what if your job was to, yeah, like
Yeah.
yeah, what if a Nazi had that idea, right? You were a Nazi scientist, or you were uh, a medical Nazi at the camps, right? They did unspeakably horrible things. Uh, what if they got that in their head of like, well, my job is to torture people. I should be in order to find inner peace, I should be the best torturer
Hmm.
I can be and find pride in that, right? Like we all know that's fucked up in a way, but at the same time, it's philosophically there.
This is,
Like,
this is my point. I think if you see, I don't have a lot of basis for this. So this is me entirely imposing an opinion on lack of knowledge.
okay, you've put it out there, so let's hear it.
But if
Yeah.
you pitched to Confucius or Confucianism, the seven deadly sins, they would be like, yes, you should do your thing, but your thing shouldn't have you commit any of those sins, because those sins would be you falling out of line with it. Now,
Yeah.
again, your point gets tricky, is and this is my thing, right? Is if people weren't, giving into their own pride, their own wrath, if they were just going along with it, um, then you have the problem you just said, right? Where it's like if they were doing that, then the bad is different. I guess that's the point, is that that's a different type of bad than the ego sin bad. Um, and I don't know how to reconcile that. If Because again, I would think within the Confucius straight up thought, they would say the seven deadly sins are behaviors that aren't the polished version.
Mhm.
But if you had somebody who wasn't giving into those things, but this is kind of where my question lies. Could you do that type of thing without that?
Um,
Because it's the humans are capable of that, sure. Is a human that hasn't tapped into that like corrupted ego capable of doing that? And I think there wasn't that many psychopaths. I think that's basically my point, is that yes, that happens with psychopaths. Psychopaths are unique in that uh they're either so egocentric that it's seamless, or they really don't have an ego. They are entirely creatures of impulse.
mhm.
Um, and there's a piece to that. But the probability of there being that many psychopaths just, reading the Tao Te Ching, sipping tea while murdering people, like very unlikely. I feel like there had to be more buy-in.
Yeah, certainly. It just really kind of drives home the point uh, that so much of what we're talking about is psychologically based. Like it's a sociologically based. Because like someone whose brain chemistry, such as a psychopath, right? Like someone who is entirely a creature of impulse, uh, is outside of society, right? They're not part of the whole thing because they disrupt it with their actions.
Right.
Um,
And
yeah,
you could say that they commit those sins by a normal person standard, right? So they're
exactly.
not,
There
they're
has to
not
be a level of normal that
yeah,
they deviate from.
but they're not committing it in the same way a normal person does. But the reason it's looked down
Exactly.
upon is because they're doing the same thing.
Right. Exactly. So in like that's where it gets really tricky, isn't it? Because in the philosophical good of just it is, right? It's if you're following nature, the universal nature, then that is kind of the overall philosophical good. A psychopath is doing that. That's the scary part.
Mhm. Yeah.
Like they're not going against their nature, which
Mhm.
is yeah. So that's why it's so biological, these kinds of things, because it isn't normal. Like, yeah, we're all capable of terrible acts. Um, but we have that gate that we can't pass through, or that it takes
Mhm.
a lot more to pass through. Them, the door seems to always be open if it's there at all.
Well,
So it's yeah.
psychopaths are tricky because there's psychopaths of impulse and psychopaths that lack basically empathy is the biggest thing.
Yeah,
Um, so they can be excessively methodical because they don't even get upset the same way. They
right,
can't be bothered. So their desires are more pure in that sense.
right,
They you can't knock them off track with consequences of morality. The only consequences they care about are ones that actually stop them,
hmm,
which means that inevitably they behave within a certain moral frame, but out of
right.
convenience.
But that's more logic based than
Yeah,
let's
they're not
say
doing it because it's wrong. They're doing it because it's inconvenient to their goal.
exactly. Which man, side tangent, but how many psychopaths do you think have walked past you in your life and they just know it's not the opportune time to murder somebody, so your life is saved?
I haven't
Like,
I haven't hung out at many ball or charity events that are more than $5,000 a plate, so probably not many.
okay, fair enough. Yep, man. Yeah, that's the scary part. Is the
Because
logical ones tend to do pretty well.
statistically, the hyper successful people in any field have a predisposition. Not it's psychopaths have a predisposition to being very good at things. So the
Right.
best at
Because
things.
they can regulate. They can, they don't need this emotion. They just need to do this thing. Yeah.
Mhm.
That's a
Yep.
whole situation. Yep. So that's why we shouldn't always look at the world's most conventionally successful people when we're talking about these concepts, right? A lot of people are like, oh well, you know, the wealthy class is good. I mean, not there are good people in that for sure. Um, as far as just a class with lots of money, I don't really know if that's good or evil. Uh, but generally speaking, if you have built that, you had to make harsh decisions. And normally you don't let yourself feel for those kinds of decisions.
Mhm.
And that's a whole situation of we shouldn't be looking at the outliers to they're the exception that define the rule, right? Like the outliers are supposed to be there to remind us that they're outliers.
Mhm.
But we have fallen into the trap, especially with social media being huge in the last 20 years, of that being more defined as normal because it's thrown in our face the most, rather than us looking around us and realizing, oh yeah, we're one of 3 million pretty average people. And that's not a bad thing. I wish people recognized
Mhm.
that.
It's funny that like the 90s to early 2000s, you saw it, but it was cheesy because of how ridiculous it was. So you know, they didn't make it seem like it was normal. It was
Right.
lifestyles of the rich and famous, like or cribs, and like
Yeah.
they're like, this is weird. Check out how weird this is.
Right.
But cool. It's cool and weird. But they left it be weird. But now it's just like, no, it's just cool. It's normal and cool.
It's what you should want. Yeah.
Yeah.
That's a big thing. And so like to try and define those people and what they have and how they got it is as good and bad. How they got it, you might be able to argue about. But trying to define those individuals or families as
The trouble is
that.
it's stereotypes, right? Because they have a
Yeah.
predisposition to partake in those types of uh, I think I want to find another word for sin so that we don't have to keep saying the seven deadly sins. Because the sin, well, it works, I guess. But yeah, those people have a predisposition to those characteristics.
Right. Right.
Or people rather have are willing to people are predisposed to engage in those things to get the result. I mean, that might be a better way to put it. To kind of say what you're saying, where it's like, well, just because you're that doesn't mean you've done the bad things, but typically people that are willing to do the bad things get there.
Yep. Yeah. That's just it. I mean, you look at and that can be, it's not like you're squashing other lives all the time to do that. That's how you get good at anything is you have to make the tough choices. If you want a lean muscular body, you gotta make the tough choice and just put your emotion to the side and not eat the cupcake. You want the cupcake. The cupcake is, it reminds you of baking with grandma when you were 12, all that kind of stuff. Like there's a lot of emotion in that stuff. But the people who, have the types of bodies that we're talking about are able to, put the fork down or eat the right kinds of things that suck.
But it's weird because you hear a lot of that type of discipline talk from the entrepreneurial crowd. Like that's what it takes to be successful. But a lot of the super successful people are off the fucking rails emotionally. Like they aren't in control. They're just
Right.
powerhouses. As they have laser like focus, but not laser like control.
Yeah, that's precisely it. That's exactly it. So
Um,
they're the Sith version, right? Where they'll grab it by the horns, but they will just keep going.
yeah. But people being like, oh, like discipline leads to success. No, focus. Focus does.
It truly, absolutely. Um, something that I always laugh about is like the people who are, you hear about it with like writers or creative, people, creative artists and all that. Oh, it's like, oh, I was so into it, I forgot to eat. I'm like,
Mhm.
that's never happened to me before in my life. I have put off eating in order to, finish a creative endeavor or whatever I'm doing. Never have I ever in my life looked at the clock and went, "Huh, I haven't eaten today." That's just not a thing. I know this is kind of a tangent, but like, no,
Oh, we need
it's
those.
right. But it also does speak to your point of that's an outlier thing. Like
Yeah,
laser
definitely.
focus to the
Yeah,
detriment of everything else.
not necessarily everything else, but it has to be detrimental, right? Because
Right.
there's things trying to pull you away. You have to say nope, nope, nope.
Right. Um, and you
And
see that a
often,
lot in business, like you said. Not even entrepreneurials, just a lot of higher ups in business, CEOs and the like. They neglect their families. They neglect their health a lot of the time. Like they're at the office constantly. They put their entire a lot of them do put their entire ego into their job, into the office.
yes, and I think that's where you see it. I don't know if I'm just stuck on the idea or if it's just really that good of idea, but the seven deadly sins are the closest thing you can get. When I again within the concept of corrupted ego behavior, probably the closest you can get to to objectively bad. That anything that falls under those categories done in an egoic way is bad. Um, and it ultimately comes to the fact that it disrupts the order. So if you don't think having order is good, then you could argue that they're not bad. But in the name of an ordered society, and again, not dystopian order, just the we get along, you can feel safe in your own home, you have
Right.
rights, that
Right.
type of thing. The whole point of each of the sins is that the excess of it puts strain on the order, puts strain on the structure, and that's why they're bad.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I don't think it's a like I think you're barking up the right tree with that. It's not a you're not being excessive ironically. You're not being excessive with this idea. Because that the thought like people have basically done the thinking on this already. Like we're not coming up with we're not coming up with the sins ourselves, right? Like
Mm,
they've been it's a distilled version of every philosophical thought up to that point.
mhm.
So it is correct to use them in the way you are, because the, that all of that has been funneled down to like how we can use it this way. So
But
it's
is there
perfect.
anything that's better? Like I can't. I've
No, I
studied
mean
a lot of
the only
theories, and
thing, yeah, the only thing, the only like next level of the funnel, I guess, would be uh it all boils down to yeah, excess, which you said. Excess that disrupts, which is why addictions are, so so bad. Or phobias. Like a phobia is defined by something that disrupts your life. So you can be scared of spiders, sure. Not like them very much, don't want to be around them. Um, but if you like were doing, I don't know, if you were driving and you saw a spider, uh, walk across your dashboard, it might freak you out a little bit. You'd be uncomfortable. But that's just a fear of spiders. A phobia of spiders, you will crash your car. Like you will stop and get out and torch the fucker. Like that is a phobia. So those should not be taken lightly if they're actually diagnosed, because that
yeah.
is, that's akin to the sins, right? Their
But
fear, it's a fear taken so far that it's disruptive to your life and therefore society as a whole.
this is why I brought up the pagan sanctifying tradition. Is that excess itself isn't bad, because if you have an excess of love of life, right, like that type of stuff, and you could make an argument it's bad, but the argument almost has to fundamentally be built around your ego is the one doing it. It's not uh letting yourself get lost in it. You're trying to like grab it.
Precisely. Yeah, because I was about to start arguing with you on the excess of life thing, because if it's a detriment to if you're out there just smelling the roses and living life, but the cow has to get milked, otherwise your daughter can't, have breakfast, like, and therefore will be malnourished and maybe die. Like that's bad. But that's because your ego has taken the wheel. And your ego is the one who's like, oh, this life, it's so great, it's so wonderful. I must experience it all. It's about you and not
Mhm.
just enjoyment of what is.
Yeah,
And
well,
there,
because
yeah,
like that would be, you have to milk the cow. So you milk the cow, and while you're milking the cow, you like rub your face against its fur. And you're like, cow, like you're in it.
which, yeah, which for anyone who might have cringed at that, go meet a cow. They're giant puppies. It's wonderful.
Yeah, Um, yeah, because you have to. It's tough to have an excess when the experience dictates itself.
Right. Yeah, because the experience will decide when it's over.
Yeah, because the only way to disrupt, yeah, so maybe it's not possible to have, it would be excess if you forced it. I guess that would be the point.
Yeah. And if you
Uh,
forced it, that's your ego.
yeah, right. Basically that you forced excess. Um, I think maybe that could be, yeah, I think that's, mhm. I think we've got a good two-word term that describes bad. Forced excess.
It
Doesn't
truly, we've done it. We've cracked the code.
and it doesn't have to feel forced, right? That's the thing. It's like it's
Yeah.
well, I want it. I'm not forcing it. This is just what I want. It's like, okay, but you're forcing things
The
to
fact that
happen.
you used I in the sentence
Yeah,
means, yeah.
that one's tricky
Yeah.
because that's another one of those English words that just got. There's a couple different ways to talk about it.
Truly, truly. My question, so I completely agree with everything that we just talked about. Um, one little like chink in the armor that I want to pick at is the concept of addiction, right? Like, because you're a philosopher, I'm a uh non-licensed psychologist, right? Like, so the concept of addiction, where it might not be a choice, but it's still forced, like, a lot of people are victims to addiction, but addictions are also built because habits are a thing, and it's been found now that we can build habits and do all that. So like there's this whole psychology bubble around this spider web going around it that I want to try and think about. So like, where
Well,
does
okay,
addiction fit into this
okay.
definition?
So yeah, now we're into. mm, yeah, I realize that I pinhold bad in terms of the morally bad. Morally bad,
Which we set out to do that. So that's not,
yeah.
that's fine.
And morally bad in the sense of an individual's relationship to it, because it's like, well, how bad is it when somebody dies in a car crash, right? Like we can say that's bad. That's, but the ego person come into play with that, right? Like
Right.
it's bad because I don't know. You could argue it's an excess, one more death than there was supposed to be, or whatever it is. But yeah, it doesn't fit that mold quite as well. And I think the addiction falls into that category. It's a thing that happens that's bad. So it's not somebody doing something bad. It's a thing that happens that's bad, and that's a different category. Hmm.
Yeah, it's tricky because and addictions, they can manifest differently, right? So a lot of it is contextual. So there might not be a right answer, you know, unless we try and
Well,
diagnose it a bit more.
but in theory, they're all bad for the same reason, right? Um,
Yeah, exactly. Right.
I think all that stuff has to come down to it. It takes away an individual's autonomy. I think that seems to be, at least in the couple examples right there, that seems to be the thread. It's
Sure.
something that takes away somebody's autonomy, and this then goes to why it's like government doing this, religion doing that, or whatever. It's there seems to be a continuous uh not compulsion, uh a sentiment that things that take away individual autonomy um in a distinct way are bad.
Yeah. Yeah. Because I mean, it's funny because one can choose to give up their autonomy, which is an act of autonomy. That's a that's a catch 22 or an oxymoron, maybe. I don't know. It's silly. It's rather silly. But yeah, as far as addictions, I mean, you might have chosen to, try the drug in the first place, or whatever it is. Um, but eventually, you're right. It's something that takes over and doesn't. It's not a choice anymore, which is a lot of people argue with that.
Yeah,
But I would also come back with saying like, okay, but you ever truly experienced an addiction, because I will never speak to, I'll never speak to alcoholism as, this or that, because first of all, there's different gradients and levels and a spectrum to everything, right? So maybe for some people, yes, it is about just putting in the grit and saying no, putting your foot down. For some people, I don't know, there's chemical dependence at some point.
But you can choose. That's the thing. You can choose to fight that. The thing that's not being mentioned is what you're choosing to do is suffer immensely.
Yeah, which we're not built to do. We don't like that.
Um, yeah, that's where it gets tricky, because that's what makes addiction so dangerous. Is once you're addicted, as like an actual addiction, the suffering you'll go through quitting or through withdrawals or breaking away might not be as bad as the end result of continuing the addiction, but it is worse than the immediate experience of the addiction.
Yeah. And that like kind of brings full circle the question of stealing a loaf of bread is bad, except when, right? Like, because
Mm.
we could all argue that that's suffering, at least at that level, that personal amount of suffering is bad. Except when what you're doing, you know, will eventually, I don't know, like let's dig into this. Let's see what happens.
Uh, I don't know if it is though, because no one's doing it to you. It's unfortunate.
Sure.
I don't know if you could call it bad though.
I guess that's again it's the choice you make, right? Like if
Mhm.
you have an addiction, you can choose to label it as good or bad for you.
Mm.
Or at least, I don't know if anyone has labeled an addiction as good for them necessarily.
Oh, yeah, I certainly have. Like people label other people's addictions as good. Oh, their music sucked after they stopped doing drugs. Like,
Oh, yeah, that kind
yeah,
of stuff. Oh, that's more of a side effect type of thing of like,
yeah, but
is the
it's
addiction itself good,
no. I
Right.
think that falls into the autonomy thing. That's what makes addictions bad.
Right.
That it's so you have a choice to not pay your taxes, right? It's that thing.
I think nobody misses you. Yeah. Try not paying taxes for a while.
Yeah, where there's a choice, sort of.
Right. Well, and that goes back to we talked about this in the happiness episode of there's your choices and your acceptance of the fallout from those
Mm,
choices. You make a choice and you're willing to accept whatever consequences there are. And that's consequences are not good or bad. Consequences are just the result of the choice, right?
mhm.
Because we always think of the consequences, and we automatically put that in the category of they're going to be bad. But it's like, no, like the consequence of, eating more water is that you're hydrated, or drinking more water is that you're hydrated.
Yeah.
Things like that. It's a consequence is just a progression. It's
Mm,
what happens next. Anyways, that's a tangent, but an important one, I feel.
words.
Words, we like them too much. So like addictions kind of by definition are not good, because there's a healthy amount. It's the excess thing, right? There's a healthy amount of really liking something, like someone who just they really have a sweet tooth, they enjoy sugar,
Mm,
they'll always get dessert at meals, um even if they don't finish the pie or whatever, they just really enjoy a good piece of pie, all that kind of stuff. And then there's the people who will eat a whole pie, like
mhm.
you know that's more than a sweet tooth.
Yeah, yeah. I think because like yeah, I think it ultimately comes down to the autonomy thing. I think I can stick by that gun because so like
Sure.
uh
So go ahead, finish your thought, I'm sorry.
So with the pie example, that's gluttony, right? So that's an individual choosing that. That's different than the car crash, the addiction, the thing happening being bad. Thing
Mhm.
happening being bad is bad on a scale based on how much it takes away autonomy.
Right.
Because like with the addiction, you do still have the choice, but you're not being excessive because you keep some. It would be worse, right? If you're choosing to excessively do the thing in spite of. Um, if you're just struggling to choosing to stop because of the cost, the consequence of stopping, the immediate consequence,
Mhm.
um, that's the addiction controlling you by making it harder to choose the other thing.
Right.
So it's bad in relation to that, which isn't as bad as somebody dying accidentally or something, because that's full stop autonomy gone.
Right.
Or even if somebody uh, like tortures you or whatever. But I think it all falls into the scale of how much is it affecting your autonomy determines how bad a thing happening is.
Yes.
And because addiction falls into this weird middle ground where it's still a choice, but it's a choice on pain of um, it's still quite a bit of loss of autonomy in that regard.
Absolutely. No, I like that definition a lot. So what then, where does the ego come in with addiction? Because excess, the too much of something.
Mhm.
How did you say it? The two words, something excess or
Forced excess,
forced excess, right? That's the ego taking over.
right?
Does the ego play that role where addiction is concerned?
No, and this is the once you brought that up, I realized that there's uh, doing bad and happening. Bad happening is the destruction of somebody's, like the restriction or destruction of autonomy. Bad doing is forced excess.
Gotcha. Too much autonomy.
Abuse of autonomy.
Yeah, exactly.
One is the
So,
taking away of, the other one is the abuse of.
right. So that's really important. And I feel
That's
like
for, oh,
and I
go
feel
on.
like if listeners get this far, it's super important that we discuss these things. Not that we're like the smartest two people on the face of the earth, because we're definitely not,
Mm,
but it's important for just people to talk about these things and try to find those distinctions, because when you fall into these kinds of behaviors, or you start to notice them in others or yourself, you can then go, oh, am I doing bad, or is bad happening to me?
mhm.
You can then
And
start to deal with the situation however it needs to be dealt with.
and in the note of like identifying, when you see somebody that you feel is very bad, it's typically because they hit the intersection of they are being excessive, forcefully excessive, and reducing other people's autonomy at the same time. That is a bad person, right? Like that's what we're the intersection of evil, right?
Right. No, that's precisely it. I mean, that's the whole story of the Jews in Egypt, the story of Moses, right? Like, the pharaohs were becoming excessive. We need more statues, more pyramids, more me, and you're
Mhm.
going to do
Yep.
it. What do you mean you don't like doing it? You know what? You're still going to make bricks, but no more straw. Like, like, yeah, that, just stripping away of their autonomy. Like,
Mhm.
that's the quintessential story. That's the moral of that story, which they
Mhm.
are a book of stories with morals. Quit talking about like it's history, everybody. Calm down. I'm not going to open that can of worms. We'll talk about the Bible in another episode, I'm sure.
Well, we've got more of a base that we know it will. Like,
Right. Yeah.
hoorah or get upset. I don't think it really matters. When we decide to do it, we're going to do it.
Yeah, it's true. Because it needs to be talked about. Like, whether you agree or disagree, it should be talked about.
Mhm.
So, uh, yeah. And so that is, like we're not discovering anything new, right? We're just discovering it for ourselves, because history may not repeat itself, but it damn sure rhymes. So we need to be able to identify these things in the contemporary era, right?
Mhm.
Because we can read about it in stories, we can read about it in history. We don't always recognize it in our own lives until perhaps it's too late.
And there's not a lot of opportunities in day to day to have this kind of conversations for most people. Like, because it's
Truly.
you've got to either do some research first, or you really got to be able to like take some time and back and forth and back and forth. And it's just that's, I don't know. The whole
It's
point is we're
consuming. Yeah, it's time consuming. It consumes what one of my friends calls brain calories, because
Mhm,
we only have so much thought muscle to use per day, essentially.
mhm. Yeah, and we're as the Metametheus project, we're not trying to give the answers. We're trying to have the conversation in a expedited format because we've done these conversations with our friends, but specifically you and I are really good at working through them most of the time.
Yeah, I mean, well, like you said, we're friends, right? So we're gonna dick around sometimes, as friends do.
Or we'll pick one like happiness where we were all over the place.
Yeah, it's a broad topic. I'm
Uh,
not disappointed in our conversation because it was a
nope,
conversation. Like,
nope.
that's all it is.
Um,
Overall, on the good.
yeah. All right, I think we're good with that, and I think that now we're to the point where maybe we can dig into ugly, like evil, that concept. Uh,
Yes, I started to lean that direction, and I'm glad you did the you put the bumper out and just helped me back in,
yeah,
because
because
we're
that
ready.
now there's bad, right? We can say on a behavioral level and a situational level. I think those are pretty good definitions. Um,
Yeah, I agree. Absolutely.
between my philosophical self doubt and your love of if there's a hole in the armor, you poke it with an arrow.
Yeah.
I think those are pretty sound since we're both like, yeah, okay, I think those stand. But then, yeah, that gets on to the ugly. So, yeah, that'll be next. That one will be fun. I'm excited for that one.
Yes. No, I'll find a poncho to wear to end the trilogy of the good, the bad, and the ugly. That'll be good.
Sweet. All right, on to the final in the trilogy.